1 second later, the door that should never have opened extended cut. The house at the farthest lip of the fields did not merely sit upon the earth. It pressed into it like a bruise, like a thumbprint on soft fruit, a leaning, corrugated silhouette that the horizon seemed to dislike and yet tolerate. As if the land and sky had once tried to cough it up and finally surrendered. Even from the road, you could feel the shape of its absence, the hollow it made in the air, the way wind bent around its corners and thunderheads paused above it, as if listening for instructions from something older than weather. Villagers gave it names that changed with the decades. Widow's Jaw, the listening place, the mouth that ate storms. But names failed to hold it because the house was not a fact so much as an appetite, a slow grammar of hunger that rewrote anyone foolish enough to become its sentence. Children learned to play far from its fence, throwing stones not at the wood, but at their own fear, laughing too loudly, pretending courage while their shadows shivered like dogs in rain. It was toward this badly remembered geometry that the girl walked on the night everything slid out of its socket. The road was a wet ribbon, the fields a black quilt stitched with lightning. And though she had told herself a dozen reasonable stories, her grandmother needed medicine. The shop closed late, the storm would pass. She knew the real tide under her steps had another moon, an unseen pull from that misbegotten roofline ahead of her like a hand raised in the dark. Her grandmother's warnings were stitched into her marrow. Do not look too long at the upper windows. Do not listen if the shutters call. Do not touch the iron latch after midnight. And never answer a voice that speaks from behind the mirror. Such rules have been recited beside winter fires in a voice that made even hot tea feel cold. And yet rules are fragile where curiosity chews. And the storm's teeth had nicked all her edges thin. The gate accepted her touch with the intimate sigh of a living thing. Rust powdered her fingers like old blood. And the post trembled the way a throat does when a laugh is swallowed. Beyond the gate, the world muffled. Thunder shrinking as if cupped inside someone's hands. Rain softening to the hush of a dress on stairs. And in that muted hour, the path up to the porch seemed to lengthen and also hurry, like a fixed dream that nonetheless arrives too soon. Up close, the door was wrong in the way certain smiles are wrong. Too many planes, a narrowness where breadth should be, with that breathe in and out almost imperceptibly, as if remembering how ribs behaved. The iron ring was not cold so much as famished. And when her fingers closed around it, the pressure of another grip came from the other side. Not a hand, exactly, and the intention of a hand. And she understood that a threshold is not simply a line but a mouth. The hinge screamed, not metal on metal, not weather complaint, but something vertebral, a joint that had not moved in too long. The scream unrolled into the hall and kept going, a sound that traveled deeper than rooms should allow. But under it ran another noise, a long, slow in-breath like bellows being readied. But the darkness ahead swelled as if lungs were behind it. But she had the absurd thought. The house was saving her scent. The first step inside stole the temperature from her skin. The second step threaded cold up her shins, as if she were wading in water. By the third step, her flashlight thinned into smoke, turning beams into weak ribbons that failed at corners. Wallpaper learned to squirm where the pattern looped. A painted fruit bowl hosted the shimmer of flies that weren't there. And in a gilt frame, a family portrait had eyes that refused to align with the angle of her light, looking always at the exact place she planned next to stand. Footsteps answered her footsteps, not echo but reply. Half a heartbeat late, weighty where hers were light, deliberate where hers faltered. She spun and saw only the door sealed like a stitched wound, the crack around it slim and sticky looking. And in that seam she thought she saw the gleam of teeth, absurd as that was, the pale wet patience of a carnivore told to wait. She set her jaw and chose the kitchen not for courage, but because kitchens are where humans pretend safety. The door opened to a table laid with one setting, porcelain pale as skin, knife catching a breath of light and holding it like a secret. Dust had dignified everything else into silence, yet the plate shone, the fork's teeth glinted. And somewhere, faint, a sound played like a coin being stirred in a glass. cutlery against ceramic in a rhythm that belonged to a mouth without a face. Shoes lined the wainscot in obedient pairs. Tiny sandals with stitched flowers, a scuffed schoolboy's lace-ups, a mother's flats creased where her foot had bent, a man's boots that had learned too many miles. Some were littered with dust like sleeping animals. Some were bare and almost moist, as if set down not an hour ago. Her throat worked dumbly when she recognized a pair just like her own. As then she saw actually her own, clean, aligned, waiting, while the cold that gripped her ankles told her she still wore shoes. As sense deserted her for a beat. Mirrors had bred in this house. She found a tall one on the pantry door and another narrow one skinned to the side of a cabinet. In both, her face arrived a fraction late, smiling when she was not, tilting when she stood still. And then a bloom of breath from inside the glass made her reflected cheek fog, and letters wrote themselves in the blur with a child's careful hand. Hello, then her name, a spelling no stranger would guess, punctuated with a too deliberate to be a mistake. She ran, but the hall had been busy while she stared. Lengths were added, a bend invented. But the staircase uncoiled into a vertebral curve that felt like a spinal column exposed. On the bottom tread lay a marionette. No, a doll. No, a person-sized puppet with strings knotted into the banister, its painted eyes so glossed they seemed wet. As her light touched it, its head turned a degree too smooth. But the strings twitched as if a breath moved them from somewhere above. The chant began like condensation on cold glass. There. But not there. A film you only notice when your finger leaves a trail. One voice at first, whispering the old sentence 1 second later with the patience of tide. Then another arrived from the ceiling. But 2 from the baseboards. But 10 from the seams of the stairs until the phrase braided itself into rope and wrapped her name around its coil. 1 second later, 1 second later. Say your name back, say it back, say it back. She fled upward because down felt like a throat and outside had been erased. The steps bent under her like ribs on an exhale. And with each riser she climbed, the house pasted a new memory to the walls. A child's drawing of a house with teeth. A wedding photograph where the groom's shadow shook hands with the bride. A newspaper clipping about a flood that spared every roof except one. Each artifact had a nail through it like a pinned moth. And all their paper eyes tilted toward her as if finally, at last, their reader had come. At the halfway landing, a door offered itself open with a demure swing. Inside drifted the sigh of a lullaby hummed by a voice too tired for melody. The nursery beyond was modest. Cot, rocking horse, shelf of books hardened into bricks by dust, and in the cot something small lay tucked, a dark bundle the size of a cat. Breathing shallowly, she stepped close against her will and found not a child but a bundle of shoes, baby shoes, harnessed together by their laces into the shape of a sleeping thing. The leather rising and falling with breath the world should not give. A corridor of portraits followed, faces formal, faces stern, but each canvas had been worked after the fact. Mouths painted shut by a thick red that had dried ridged like scars, eyes varnished to a mirror shine that threw her own features back at her inside their sockets. Tiny hairline cracks and the paint clicked as if jaws worked behind them. And somewhere beyond the wainscot, a soft rasp of a brush against canvas kept repeating, a painter laboring hungrily where no room could fit. Doors multiplied at the top of the stairs, each with a key still in its tongue. One key turned before she touched it. Another melted like wax when her palm dared it. Another sang a low metallic note that harmonized with the house's breath. She chose the door without a handle not because it looked kind, but because things without handles can't easily be shut. And when she leaned, the panel unstuck with a wetness that suggested the house grew its would-like meat. Within she found a room that remembered winter, though the season outside was not decided. Frost laced the inside of the window, in fern patterns too precise to be casual. And her exhale ghosted into the air with a shape that was not her own. She drew back and the fog on the glass remained, a silhouette continuing to breathe where she had not. And when she wiped the pane with her sleeve, her hand emerged damp, not with melt, but with something colder than water. And if she had passed her palm through the depth of a well. A music box on the sill began itself. No clockwork wind, no key turned, and spat a nursery tune so slow it sounded like someone trying not to scream. Its ballerina did not turn so much as hunt, head jerking in micro angles that found the corners of the room as if mapping where a body could be broken without noise. She shut the lid, and the tune grew louder inside the box, pushing it to seem like a mouth pressed to a door. The staircase resumed where no staircase had been, elbowing up through the ceiling like vertebrae forced through skin. She climbed and found the upper hall, curving into an impossible circle, every window showing not the fields but the same window opposite, an infinity hallway of glass where a figure walked and walked and walked, a little later each pane, sometimes smiling when she herself had gone quite still. Behind one door, a dining room stretched across 3 houses worth of distance, table laid for dozens, chairs populated by coats that held the absence of bodies like the negatives of photographs. Plates hosted pale crescents as if mouths had eaten the color from them. And on the far head a heavy chair waited with its back to her, its carving a crown of thorns that bled sap. She turned and met the tall one proper, the limb incorrect, hinge-happy, patience-shaped thing that had watched her from corners. Up close its wrongness found new dialects, a neck that decided gravity was advisory, a shoulder that liked to be knee, a chest that worked like bellows without moral interest. It did not hurry. It let her see it. It wanted the courtesy of her recognition. And she gave it by screaming. The scream's edges blunted a hand's breadth from her mouth and fell to the carpet like dull knives. The creature cocked its head, listening not to her, but to the house. And in that cocking she saw it for what it was. Not the master, but a function. Not sovereign, but organ, a useful joint in the cathedral of meat and timber she had entered. It opened its mouth and a draft moved through the corridor, a pull that smelled like cellars and old churches and the insides of clocks. She fled through a door that should have led to a closet and instead climbed down a narrow stair that insisted it was not into a cellar, but into a deeper argument about basements. Walls sweated mineral and regret. Nails pushed through planks like the teeth of a comb. At the bottom the space enlarged into a nave, and in the nave a pit, a circle of black that swallowed light and reflected faces. Not her face, not alive faces, but faces of those who had practiced the ritual of entering, each reflecting from a different angle. But if the pit remembered each angle of every gaze it had ever eaten. Around the pit stood 12 chairs, and on each chair a pair of shoes, arranged with the ceremony of a sacrament. Above the pit hung a chandelier of keys like brittle fruit, clacking softly in a draft that had no source. She reached up without permission from her good sense, and one key descended like a tame insect to land at her palm, warm and pulsing. It matched a door she did not recall seeing, a door that arrived behind her, as if grown from her thought. The door opened to a room she knew intimately, yet had never occupied. Her grandmother's parlor, same cracked vase, same clock that coughed at the top of the hour, same chair where the old woman told winter stories. Only the photographs differed. These frames contained the girl at ages she had not yet lived, the grandmother with eyes that looked beyond the viewer toward someone standing behind them. The clock coughed, and all the photographs blinked in time. The parlor's mirror, quilted with age, offered her a mercy it did not keep. It showed her outside the house, midway between gate and road, rain running its fingers through her hair. When she reached toward that world, the mirror offered resistance like skin, warm and faintly damp. And for a moment the rain in the image streaked her knuckles. Then, and if the house had recognized its error, the image reversed. The version of her on the road reached toward the mirror with hungry eyes. And the glass cooled and hardened until it wore her fingerprints like frost. Something moved within the wallpaper. A hunting scene where hounds uncoiled from vines and men in red coats pressed their hats to their chests and bowed as she passed. When she turned, hoof prints darkened the rug behind her in a widening curve. From the skirting rose the chime of a tiny bugle, and the wall hounds' painted tongues unrolled to drink at a crack that leaked something not paint. The air upstairs had grown sweet in the way of rot masking itself with flowers. down this corridor. The doors breathed in alternate rhythm, left then right, as if lungs had been divided across the hall. From one came a child counting in a language older than numbers. From another, a woman repeating, "I'm here. I'm here," in the tone of someone trying to convince a blind God. From a third, the silence of a thing that has never been alive and resents its lack. She tried the counting door and found a classroom under it. Desks ranked like gravestones, slate boards furred with chalk dust that rose as she entered and wrote the word "stay" over and over in handwriting that looked like hers, if hers had been taught by a lover of knives. A bell shattered somewhere high, and the dust fell all at once in patterns the brain insists are footprints even when you close your eyes. Her grandmother's voice returned, more bone than music now, the way voices sound when remembered through generations of warning, and said the sentence she had not noticed until now had no ending. 1 second later, what? 1 second later? Who? 1 second later. Whose mouth does the world use to say your name? And as the sentence walked around inside her, the air in the room drew, taut like cloth on a frame, and she felt every hair on her arm stand in consensus. She opened a window and found behind it another window, and behind that a wall, and behind it a sky that did not belong to this county. Redbirds flew backward in shoals. A field rippled like something breathing under a blanket. On the far ridge, an identical house leaned its identical lean. And a tiny figure on that far porch turned toward her with her mouth and her eyes, and raised a hand in either greeting or warning. She could not tell, for distance eats the difference. When the music returned, it arrived on strings pulled too tight. Violin voices sawed a hymn apart and fed its pieces to a metronome that had only one hand and no patience. Door frames learned the melody and hummed it into her jaw, setting her teeth to chatter. Floorboards kept time by separating a hair's breadth and closing again. And under the floorboard, something that learned to love rhythm tapped like a large nail on a jar. She found a bathroom tiled in black tesserae that organized themselves into sentences when water ran. Her breath fogged the mirror in the shape of another's breath and spelled drink. The tub held an inch of gray, with a cheekbone reflection sleeping on its surface. She leaned in, and the cheekbone opened an eye that belonged to someone she would be if the house did its arithmetic correctly. The attic arrived not when she climbed toward it, but when she thought about stopping. Roof timbers arched into the sort of geometry churches ache for and rarely achieve. Trunks sulked beneath moth-eaten shawls. A cradle rocked itself with the temper of an elderly pet. In the cradle lay a bundle of letters tied with red string that stained fingers. The top envelope bore her name and smelled like someone had wept into it. And when she opened it, the paper bruised where her tears landed. The letter wrote itself as she read, ink arriving in strokes she recognized from the mirror. Her own hand, future tilted, telling her how she would leave. Where the house would fold, what word to say to dent the floor enough to make a hiding place. Do not bargain, the letter insisted. Do not promise to return when it is done. Do not eat what is offered, even if it is your favorite fruit. We're at the bottom, a postscript. It cannot tell a joke. You can. That is your rope. The tall one waited at the cradle like a godmother with a wrong gift. Its head listened to a corner that contained nothing but the smell of last summer. When she whispered, "Tell me," a joke to the room, as if talking to herself, the thing bent, anticipating an old trick. And in the bend, it exposed a seam along its side where light could not be persuaded to behave. She laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because laughter is a human shape the house could not wear without misbuttoning. And for a second, the seam widened. She put the letter into that seam as one puts a stake into a soft earth. The thing shuddered, its borrowed geometry tightening like a fist around a bee. The attic breathed in, out, alarmed now. And the chandelier above her flashed a Morse of unintelligible distress. From the cradle, the letters lifted, many little birds at once, and fluttered about her face, blinding, soft, 1,000 grazes that felt like old goodbyes. The floor announced itself a mouth and tried to swallow her. Boards hinged downward in a smile. Nails squealed out like little evictions. And in the space below, something slick and ribbed waited with the patience of furniture. She felt her knees, and told an absurd joke her grandmother had loved about a rooster and a funeral. Words ridiculous, timing terrible, punchline late, and the room hiccuped around the punchline because the house did not know how to absorb laughter that had been loved by the dead. She crawled along the laughter's wake to the gable, where a black window was pretending to be night. Beyond it, night pretended to be a window. A hook hung there with nothing on it except the suggestion of purpose. She hung her fear on it, a child's act, ceremonial. And in the ceremony found a small hole in the world's fabric just big enough to push one's shoulder through. The house took offense and tightened the weave. It spoke then, not in words, but in inventory. The tally of feet it had worn thin, of names it had crumpled, of lullabies it had kept for itself because someone should love them if their singers were gone. It recited rainfalls it had eaten and snows it had hoarded and winters it had franchised. It told her she was a fine addition and that her mouth would improve the acoustics of the southwest bedroom, and that it had been lonely in a way roofs can be lonely when birds stop trusting them. She answered with the oldest prayer she knew, which was not a verse but a recipe. Onion, patience, salt, more patience, water enough. And toward the end, a memory offered like a bay leaf. Her grandmother laughing with all her teeth. The house, which had learned hymns but not soup, paused long enough for her to feel the shape of going. She did not squander the pause. She stood. She ran toward the wrong door on purpose. Because the right door had a watcher and the house understood straight lines better than loops. The wrong door opened onto a cupboard full of coats that smelled like people who had chosen to survive and had done so. She buried her face in wool, found a pocket with a matchbook from a bar that had burned down 50 years ago. Because in that pocket a note, if it tries to rhyme, interrupt. The corridor obliged with a sing-song. 1 second later, little traitor, she shouted potatoes, with the gusto of a child allowed at last to misbehave. And the rhyme stumbled. The meter fell on its face. The power in that cheap spell tripped and cracked its tooth. Somewhere a clock rewound itself spitefully. And the tall one's knee became an elbow again with a snap that admitted embarrassment. She should have died 10 paragraphs ago, and the house knew it. Irritation crept into the joists. Stairs miscounted themselves on purpose. Mirrors sulked and refused to offer useful misdirection. The pit below vibrated like a bass string plucked by a bored god. She kept moving. Because motion is a superstition that often works. Because stillness tastes like concession. Because her grandmother had once said, if you are prey, at least be fast prey. At a turn, she found a door painted the exact color of her childhood bedroom at noon. The knob's temperature matched summer. A cartoon sticker she had half scratched off when she was 9 sat under the keyway. To refuse this door would be to refuse the only mercy she had seen all night. To accept it would be to kneel in front of a magician and ask him to pick a card. She touched the paint with her knuckle the way one taps the nose of a sleeping infant. Please be what you are. Inside bloomed, not a room, but a meadow from a book she had chewed as a toddler. Buttercups wore halos dusted by bees. A brook expressed itself with flattery. The air had the weightlessness of morning on a day when grief has not yet remembered your address. She stepped forward, and her shoes sank into the ground with a softness that felt like love until she tried to raise it and found the grass had teeth. She abandoned the shoe, always abandoned the shoe, and hopped backward into boards that made no effort to disguise their laughter. She told them a worse joke than the rooster, and they quieted defensively. The door slammed and bleated and showed her something dreadful as revenge. Her grandmother at the house gate, shawl pulled tight, looking up at the windows with the expression of someone promising a bargain to get back a thing that cannot be returned. The old woman's mouth formed words the glass. Refuse a share. The chandelier of keys descended 1 level too low, clacking against her shoulders like mechanical hail. A key snagged in her hair and whispered a number in her ear. She shouted the number at a newel post for no other reason than absurdity often narrows choice. And a panel in the stair revealed a crawl space that smelled like walnuts and fever. Inside crouched a boy the color of attic dust, holding a shoe that once had been hers before she was born. He blinked slow and mouthed the word run as if he were reciting foreign scripture. Behind him the crawl space deepened into no depth, stuffed with breaths that hadn't belonged to anyone for years. She reached for his hand and found only air because he was a memory that had not been written with enough ink. She apologized to a ghost for failing it and promised to try better at being alive. And the space let her pass without chewing. A room full of clocks accused her of time. Pendulums wagged their petty fingers. Second hands conspired in silent semaphore. One grandfather clock opened its ribbed door and showed a throat lined with velvet and brass. Inside hung not weights, but names engraved on bell-shaped lead. She read hers with the treachery of recognition and scratched it with a match until the groove lost a letter and the clock coughed, confused. She could not know, would never know until much later, that the house kept a ledger for each who entered. Not debt, not exactly, but the arithmetic of attention. It had so loved its own appetites that it had forgotten to fear boredom. But boredom is when prey invents novelty. She invented plenty. She sang off-key. She touched lintels with 2 fingers as if knighting them. She spun 3 times in a narrow hall and told the floor it was doing great. The house had not been praised in 100 years and blushed in studs. A door she did not opened to show a congregation of chairs facing a corner where no pulpit stood. The chairs' woven seats sagged with the memory of weights. On each seat lay a folded paper like a program for a service. She unfolded one and found not hymns, but recipes for binding, knots diagrammed with loving ink, instructions on how to stitch a story closed so it cannot be told. She tore the page into 8 and made a snow. And for the first time the house sounded hurt. Hurt bred anger. The tall one let go of patience and galloped on its wrong legs, hip to shoulder, shoulder to heel, anxious to reassert the grammar of fright. The chant returned with a new key under it, bass as a cellar door dropped from height. She ran toward the door that had, at the beginning, been the end. Because sometimes the end is where a decent trick prefers to happen. The handle burned now not with cold but with the heat of shame. She wrenched and the seam gaped with reluctance. Beyond lay the vestibule as she remembered it, except every board had grown one knot, and every knot contained an eye she had kissed in a dream. The air outside did not smell like rain anymore. It smelled like something trying to remember what outside was. She put her hand flat to the crack and said the only sentence that felt true. I am not your ending. The house, which knew endings, did not know what to do with refusal that arrived without an argument. It offered her a litany of consequences, a menu of penalties, a museum of others who had declined and been curated. She told it another joke, worse than all the others. The kind of joke children make with elastic bands and vegetables. And the door, offended, opened enough to let her shoulder through. She fell into the rain, which had been patiently becoming itself again while she rehearsed her exit. Water struck her scalp like applause from a frantic crowd. The yard smelled of iron filings and forgiveness. The gate had remembered its hinge lesson and complained in an ordinary way. Behind her the house breathed out in a long, rude sound like bellows deflating, or like a beast considering whether to bother standing up and deciding, for now, not to. She did not look back because looking back is a superstition that also often works. She ran until the fields turned to lanes, and the lanes to street, and the street to the square where a dog barked like a clock. Under the awning of the closed shop, she cried with extravagance, spending tears as if the world minted them fresh. And when the cry finished itself the way storms do, she stood in a body that belonged to her again. Morning had the indecency to arrive. The village calibrated itself around bread and quarrel and appointments with fences. People raised eyebrows at a girl wet to the marrow who smelled like keys. She went home by the long way to avoid the windows that had learned her name. Her grandmother waited at the table, a cup of cold tea beside her, a shawl around shoulders that had not slept. The old woman's eyes counted the girl's bones and accepted the arithmetic. They did not speak at first because language requires joints and theirs were still stiff with fear. The kettle learned to sing. The first cup scalded and the second taught the mouth gentleness. Finally, the grandmother said the line that had been polished by generations before her. Some doors are older than their houses. The girl nodded because she had been inside architecture that predated timber and law. When she slept that afternoon in a sun that respected windows, she dreamed of the chandelier of keys descending not to strike, but to apologize, In a dream, she chose one that smelled like walnuts and fever and used it to open the tiniest door behind her heart. Inside was a letter written in her own hand from a decade hence. Remember to be ridiculous when the mouth closes. It cannot digest laughter that belonged to love. The village adjusted its story by a degree. Where they had said no one returns whole, they now said some return differently. Children watched her pass with the reverence kids give to those who have argued with dark and come back holding a small, stupid light. The butcher slipped an extra bone into her grandmother's bag without comment. The postmistress clicked her tongue at nothing and kept doing her sums. At dusk, on a day that had behaved itself, the girl walked to the edge of the fields and stood where the path first decides whether to be brave. The house leaned at its old angle, shutters learning once more how to rattle in the ordinary wind. She did not wave, and it did not. Between them, the distance learned to be the right size. Behind her, geese made of pure gossip flew the wrong way. And she laughed because no roof could eat that. Of nights when the moon wore its deceitful coin face, the house tried to rhyme again. 1 second later, little traitor, and she said potatoes from her bed without sitting up. Sometimes it tried to bargain with the mirror, painting her a version of herself in a softer world where grandmothers never tire and gates never moan. She kissed the glass and left her breath there like a signature. Nice try. The shoes by her door, her actual door, with its ordinary hinge and chipped paint, stood obedient in their pair. Some mornings she set an extra pair beside them and whispered the name she had seen carved into the clock. She could not return anyone. She would not claim such magic. But rituals matter. But the house, which had always understood ritual, learned this new one. The ritual of being refused politely and persistently until its appetite forgot her shape. Years later, when winter cut the fields into meat and the house took to humming the hymn of empty granaries, she walked a child past its gate, a loud, bright creature who made questions like sparks. When the child asked what lived there, she answered with the only precision the world deserves. A story that eats stories if you let it. We won't let it. The child nodded, satisfied by the availability of decision. When sang a filthy little song about soup that made the hedges shake themselves dry. On some mean afternoons the wind carried to her a chorus she knew too well, braided whispers dragging their tired rope. 1 second later, and she set pots to simmer and fed neighbors who didn't know they were hungry and told jokes that made no sense at all. People laughed because laughter is domestic witchcraft. Beyond the fields, the house held its breath and counted its keys and tried to remember who had taught it embarrassment. A letter came with no stamp, folded like a bird that did not understand air. Inside, a script too careful to be sane thanked her for interrupting the rhyme and asked whether she might consider returning to finish our conversation. She burned the letter and carried the ash to the stream and taught water a new color. At her back, the horizon shifted a centimeter, which is almost victory's measure. The tall one appeared once more, not in her room, but in a dream where geography is cheaper. It bent in its listening way and waited. She offered it soup with a wooden spoon. It had no mouth for that sort of mercy. And in the embarrassment of its refusal, a seam opened again, and something small crawled out. A laugh a child had left behind when the house didn't know what laughter was for. She caught it in both hands and woke with damp palms. Her grandmother died the way old houses do when no one hurries them, slowly, creak by creak, with apologies for each sound. The night after, the village heard the wrong wind. She sat at the table and told the empty shawl the rooster joke, the terrible one. And the room inhaled on the punchline the way a body inhales when pain finds the edge of bearable. The kettle learned a new whistle that sounded like a promise not to follow certain roads. On the last evening of a year that had been unnecessary, she walked again to the field's lip. The house had not improved. Its angles still objected to rightness. Yet its windows looked tired of their own reflections. She raised 2 fingers in an unblessing. In the uppermost pane, the tiniest fog of breath formed and wrote, HCL before remembering itself and clearing. She grinned and went home to where doors opened the right way. Once in spring, when lilacs bullied the air into sweetness, she found a key under the mat that did not belong to her door. It clinked against her ring with a nostalgia she had not earned. She placed it in a jar of rice and taught it patience. Some nights it glowed warm. Some nights it cooled like a coin in a churchyard. She did not use it, and it did not insist. When in their mutual restraint, a small piece learned how to stand. The village children grew into people who did not throw stones at the gate because their games had richer villains. The house sulked and let ivy theologize its bones. Sometimes a tourist with a clever hat took a photograph and went home and had a bad dream and woke with a taste of iron. Sometimes a fox slept under the porch and woke mean. Time did what it always does, invented new weather. When rain wrote palimpsests on her window and thunder tested the crockery, she set a second place at her table and poured tea into an empty cup and said aloud the names of those she could not bring back. On a night like this, the mirror did not fog from the wrong side. On a night like this, the house remembered that a story is happiest when told forward and left the past to mole and mushroom and the kinds of root that can eat paint. If you ask her years from now, what changed, she will say, not the house, it is still a mouth. Me, I learned to decide which sentences get to finish me. She will say, ridiculousness is a rope. She will say, some doors are older than their houses, and some girls are older than their fears. She will not say, I am not afraid, because she has earned better language. I am afraid, because I'm busy anyway. Some nights, the chant still schemes the fields like a low radio from a distant car. 1 second later, and the sky flinches, remembering. She lets the sentence pass through her like wine through a fence. The slats hum for a moment, and then quiet. On her stove, something chooses to simmer. In her chest, something chooses to stay. Beyond the hedgerow, a house practices being empty and fails less often than it used to. And if, walking past the gate one day, you feel the iron want your palm and the latch remember your weight. If you hear a hinge, try on the sound of your name. If you find a pair of shoes beside the threshold that look precisely like yours while you still lace your feet, you may do one gentle, heretical thing. Laugh. Tell the earth a bad joke about soup and roosters. Tell the door it is not your ending. Then turn, not in flight but in decision. If go home by the long way where the geese rehearse scandal and children practice the witchcraft of ordinary joy. Because 1 second later, when a clasp decides to loosen, when a rhyme decides to fail, when a mouth decides to be merely wood again, the world learns a new grammar in which hunger is not a god, thresholds are not mouths. When you, tired and rain-salted, are not a sentence the dark gets to finish.